Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, as per usual, I am joined by Dr. Sean Deneen and Chandler Foster. Today's episode is really one of the most difficult we've done because it forces us to talk about what happens when law, punishment, medicine, secrecy, and political power all start feeding each other. We're going to talk about the execution bans documented in China, the allegations that some prisoners may have been medically exploited, like organ harvesting, before or around the time of execution, and the question of whether minority groups and dissidents are being caught inside that machinery, and then the bigger warning for all societies. What happens when judges and prosecutors stop answering primarily to law and start answering to politics, fear, and public punishment culture? Dr. Deneen, maybe you can take us a little further into this.
I'll do my best. Before we go any further, folks, here is the factual ground we are standing on. Amnesty International, the worldwide human rights organization, says the People's Republic of China remains the world's leading executioner.
Whoa, that's something.
Although the real figures are hidden as state secrets and believed to be in the thousands each year, I'm shocked to learn that mobile execution vans were documented in China in the early 2000s. Now, you would think these are only for serial murderers or people committing the worst possible kind of crimes. But Chinese law says the death sentences must be approved by the Supreme People's Court, and the Reuters news agency reported in March 2025 that China executed four Canadian citizens on drug smuggling charges. Chandler, will you clarify for our listeners how we're going to separate assumption from fact?
Sure, Dr. Deneen. There is an important distinction to note right at the top. There are things in this episode that are documented. There are things that China itself later acknowledged. And there are things that remain serious allegations rather than fully transparent, independently verified facts. And we're going to keep those categories separate because once you stop doing that on a topic like this, you either become reckless or you become naive.
And we're also going to look beyond China. We're going to look around the world, including the USA. So let's start here with what in the Blinken Blanken is or was an execution van. Now, Dr. Deneen, let me hand this to you. When people hear the phrase execution van, it sounds almost too grotesque to be real. What in the heck are we talking about?
I'm very sorry to say it was real. Amnesty International reported in 2004 that Chinese authorities had begun introducing mobile execution vans in 2003. These were modified vehicles fitted for lethal injection with a metal bed, restraints, and monitoring equipment. Officials described them as more efficient, less costly, and more humane than shooting through firing squads. And that language matters because what they were really saying was that the state had found a way to make execution more portable, more streamlined, and God help us, easier to manage administratively.
Well, now you're saying it's more portable. Chandler, what does that say to you?
Well, to me, the word portable, it really hits hard, man, because once death becomes portable, then it stops feeling like a single grim ritual inside a fixed prison, and it starts to feel like something that the state can dispatch, something logistical, something optimized.
Yeah, like you can pick up your phone and have a pizza delivered, right? So
Exactly.
you can call the judge and have the execution van delivered. Yeah, and that's exactly the psychological shift. A prison chamber is already terrible, but a van, that says something else. This is not just punishment. This is deployable punishment. It suggests a system that is not morally burdened by execution so much as technically interested in making it smoother.
And history is full of governments doing just that. They don't abolish cruelty, they reorganize it. The guillotine was sold as rational during the French Revolution. Lethal injection in the United States was sold as clean and humane. Bureaucracies love to rebrand violence as procedure.
Now that's very scary. So what you're saying, Dr. Deneen, is that the van is not just a vehicle, it's almost a philosophy on wheels.
Yes, it's the philosophy that asks, how do we carry this out efficiently instead of should a modern state be doing this at all?
And that may be the first big lesson of the whole episode. When a government begins improving the delivery system for death, you're looking at a state that has already made several moral decisions before the van even exists.
Oh, now, Dr. Weaver, let me ask here the most obvious follow-up question. Is this just a China story, or are we talking about a worldwide practice here?
Okay, the execution van story in the modern documented sense is specifically associated with China. That is true. The broader story is global capital punishment. Amnesty's 2025 global report says, get this, at least 1,518 executions were recorded in 2024 across 15 countries, while also saying the total excludes the thousands believed to have been carried out in China, where the true number is treated as a state secret.
That matters because people can get mesmerized by the image of the van and miss the larger pattern. The deeper problem is not the vehicle by itself. The deeper problem is secrecy, routinization, and political comfort with hidden killings.
So the van is really a symbol of institutional confidence. And it represents a government confident enough to say, not only will we execute, we will refine execution.
Yeps. And that's why I don't want the episode to drift into look at this weird foreign gadget. That would miss the point. The point is how states normalize irreversible punishment, then dress it up as efficient governance.
It's also a manipulation of language, and once punishment is framed as governance, the entire moral vocabulary changes. Mercy becomes softness, scrutiny becomes obstruction, doubt becomes inefficiency.
And then the public gets trained to think that the real problem is delay, not wrongful death.
Exactly. You are right. So, Dr. Deneen, stay with me here. Formally speaking, who actually sentences people to death in China?
Formally, death sentences must come through the courts, what are known as provincial security committees, and Chinese criminal procedure says that all death sentences must be approved by the Supreme People's Court. Article 199 of the Criminal Procedure Law states that directly. So the official answer is lower courts impose, the higher courts review, and the top court signs off.
But that is only the legal architecture, right? That doesn't yet tell us how independent the system really is.
Yes, and that is the problem. The formal structure is not the same thing as full independence. In any system, especially an opaque one, The real question is what atmosphere surrounds the courtroom. What messages are judges getting from party institutions, anti crime campaigns, security rhetoric, and the broader political culture?
It's important to remember these courts are controlled by the Communist Party. There's no judicial independence here. Another thing that's very important is what kind of crimes qualify for capital punishment. That matters too. People often assume, as I said before, that death sentences are limited to the most shocking murders. But Reuters reported this year that China executed 4 Canadian citizens on drug smuggling charges. And we're not talking about crystal meth, they were smuggling marijuana. This is a reminder that the death penalty there extends beyond the narrowest class of homicide cases many listeners might assume.
And once death is used for drug crimes, the whole moral structure changes. Because now capital punishment is not just the state saying, this is the worst thing imaginable. It becomes the state saying, we use death as part of our wider strategy of order. Sound
Yes,
familiar? Isn't that kind of like what the Nazis used to do, you know?
yes, Chandler, you are so right. Death starts becoming a public policy instrument, not merely a last resort.
You mentioned the Nazis, Shannon. They also used mobile vans for the euthanasia program and for the earliest stages of the Holocaust. But historically, death becoming a policy issue is very dangerous. When a state uses execution as policy communication, as a warning, as a signal, as proof of toughness, legal caution and respect for rights tends to weaken. Punishment becomes expressive, it becomes ideological.
So even if the judge signs the order, the sentence may be shaped long before that by the climate that the judge lives inside.
That is exactly the deeper point. Now, one of the issues that is very troubling is this idea of organ harvesting. Could you take us a little into that, Chandler?
Well, yes, I'm going to take this to the darkest side, the darkest question directly. When people hear about execution vans, many of them think about organ harvesting. Now, what can we responsibly say about that there, Dr. Weaver?
Well, we can say several things very clearly. China long used organs from executed prisoners, and officials later said that the systematic use of organs from executed or detained prisoners for transplants ended in 2015. Uh huh. Right. But that did not end the controversy. Reuters reported in 2017 that international human rights groups and medical ethicists were still calling for more transparency. And Reuters also reported in 2019 that Beijing continued to deny accusations that it forcibly took organs from prisoners of conscience. Yeah,
Absolutely.
There is more information about this. A United Nations piece came about detailing this practice, which is crucial. In 2021, UN human rights experts said they had received credible allegations that detainees from ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities in China were being subjected to blood tests and organ examinations without informed consent. And they said they were extremely alarmed by allegations of organ harvesting targeting specific groups, including Falun Gong practitioners, Uyghurs, Tibetans, certain types of Muslims, and non officially approved Christians. The government denied all wrongdoing.
Yes, that's true, Dr. Deneen. China denied wrongdoing. So, the careful formulation is this. The historical abuse is real. The state says it reformed, and serious allegations remain unresolved enough that UN experts treated them as credible and alarming.
Yes, that's right. You know, Dr. Deneen, when you mentioned that these prisoners are still being subjected to blood tests and organ examinations without their informed consent, that points you in that direction almost irrevocably. Because why would they have to do that if they weren't going to use them? So, Chandler, you're exactly right. Also,
And what makes this morally explosive is the merging, just like the experimentation in the Nazi concentration camps, the merging of medicine and punishment. Medicine is supposed to be about healing, consent, preservation of life. When medical expertise becomes entangled with execution, whether to facilitate death, certify death, or even worse, benefit from the body afterward, something foundational has broken.
Yes, Dr. Deneen, and I think that's what terrifies people, even beyond the execution itself. It's the possibility that a prisoner is no longer just being punished, but being treated as inventory.
oh, oh, yes, that is right. A state that can look at a condemned person and also see procurement potential has crossed into a very dark moral territory. So, Chandler, you know, you specifically wanted this other point developed. So I'm going to hand it off to you. How should we talk about the claim that China may be executing people over religious differences? Religious differences.
Well, Dr. Weaver, I would put it this way. I wouldn't say that China transparently announces, oh, we execute people for believing the wrong religion. No, that's a little bit too simple. But I would say that there is strong evidence that China harshly represses religious and ethno religious minorities, and that state categories like terrorism, separatism, extremism, and even cult activity can function as vehicles for punishing people whose identities and practices are deeply tied to religion. That means that religious difference can get translated into criminal danger. Criminal danger by the state.
And the province of Xinjiang is a key example. The Office of Human Rights 2022 assessment said China's pattern of arbitrary detention and human rights abuses against Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim groups in Xinjiang may constitute crimes against humanity, and it has specifically criticized the misuse of counterterrorism and counter-extremism laws. Reuters has also reported death sentences in Xinjiang in cases the state framed as violent separatist or promoting extremist unrest.
Whoa. Oh, okay. Okay. Dr. Denis, when you say separatist or extremist unrest, does that bring to your mind like protesters and that sort of thing?
It certainly does. I know that the Uyghur people have been rounded up and put in brainwashing camps. People have lost their custody of their children, been force fed drugs, all kinds of injustices. And it happens all over the world, I'm ashamed to say.
And death sentences for them too.
Yes.
Yes. So the most careful wording is not executed for religion alone, but something like this. China has created a system in which religion, ethnicity, political disloyalty, separatism, extremism, and criminality can be fused together in state rhetoric and legal practice.
That's exactly right, Dr. Weaver. And that fusion matters because once a group is framed not as citizens with beliefs, but as a security threat, security threat, then the public becomes easier to persuade that harsh measures are justified.
This has happened repeatedly all around the world in history. Governments rarely say we are punishing faith. They say we are suppressing disorder, we are fighting extremism. They say we are defending the nation. The moral problem is that those labels can be stretched until ordinary identity itself becomes suspicious.
And the UN organ harvesting allegations matter here too. Because the groups mentioned were not random, the 2021 UN experts specifically referred to ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities, including the Falun Gong practitioners, the users, Tibetans, Muslims, and Christians too.
That's right. So even if you avoid overclaiming, the pattern is still deeply, deeply disturbing. Religious differences may not appear on the paperwork as the official reason, but it can still be one of the engines driving who becomes vulnerable.
Dr. Weaver, let me ask you something directly here.
Uh-oh.
Why does secrecy matter so much here? Why is it not just a frustrating detail, but to me it seems the heart of the problem?
Well, because secrecy changes everything. Amnesty says China keeps its death penalty numbers as state secrets. Hmm. That means outside observers cannot confidently determine how often executions occur, for which crimes, under what procedures, or with what regional variation. Once a state hides the numbers around irreversible punishment, like, death, independent oversight becomes very thin, and distrust becomes a pretty rational thought.
And secrecy does not just hide wrongdoing, Dr. Weaver. It also makes the truth harder to reconstruct afterwards.
Yeah.
Chandler, you're exactly right. In a secretive system, rumor and evidence start living too close together. Critics cannot prove anything or everything. Defenders can deny everything. And the human beings inside the machine, the accused, the prisoners, their families, disappear behind this awful phrase, state managed ambiguity.
And that ambiguity often serves power. A sufficiently opaque system lets the government say, trust us. But trust is precisely what should be least unavailable when the state is taking life.
Oh, and Dr. Weaver, that is one of the lines that I would really want listeners to take away from this here. When the punishment is irreversible, opacity is not a technical flaw. It is now a moral emergency.
Yes, Johnny, you're absolutely right. Because a hidden execution cannot be fully audited, a hidden sentence cannot be fully tested, and a hidden system invites the worst uses of fear.
Dr. Deneen, I want to widen the frame now. Let's leave China just for a moment here and ask about the general problem. Around the world, what happens when judges are openly pressured by political power?
Dr. Weaver, the answer to that is that courts may still look like courts, but their independence starts to be hollowed out. The UN Special Rapporteur's mandate on the independence of judges and lawyers says judges, prosecutors, and lawyers around the world face all kinds of problems: threats, intimidation, external interference, even arbitrary detention, prosecution, and I'm sorry to say, even killings. And the Council of Europe's Consultative Council of European Judges said in a 2025 opinion that hostile attacks on judges, verbal abuse, online harassment, intimidation, and sometimes physical violence are often fueled by political polarization and misinformation.
So sometimes the pressure is formal and sometimes it's atmospheric.
Whoa, whoa. Sometimes it's formal and sometimes it's atmospheric.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
okay. That's a kind of a stunning way to put that, Chandler. Thanks. Like
Well, you're
that.
welcome.
In some countries, the pressure is blunt. Promotions, discipline, budgets, prosecutions, or safety can depend on pleasing the people in power. I heard that one before.
Hmm.
In other places, it's more ambient, like public campaigns, smears, intimidation, constant delegitimization, and a warning shot fired at any judge who says or rules the wrong way.
And you know what is most terrifying, friends? Historically, you don't need every judge to be directly controlled. You only need enough examples to teach the rest of the judiciary what the invisible limits are.
And Dr. Deneen, that right there may be the most chilling part. The system teaches anticipation. A judge begins to think, "Oh, I know what kinds of rulings bring trouble. I know what kinds of rulings bring safety."
And once that happens, fear is already participating in the judgment.
All right, now, Dr. Weaver, let's come home to the United States. Obviously, it's a different system, but where are the pressure points in this system?
Yeah, that's interesting and probably going to be quite controversial. And if our listeners have questions or they want to make comments about it, we're open to that.
And we would like to also say that the information that we're providing here is all facts. Please look it up for yourselves. We encourage you to do that.
Absolutely. So to answer you, different systems, obviously, but where are the pressure points? Okay, there are several. First, judicial elections. In much of the United States, judges do not simply sit above politics. A state court report says judicial elections are used in 38 states, and that many of these races have become battlegrounds filled with dark money, special interests, and attack ads. Brennan Center's 2026 report says 7 states set spending records in their 23-24 judicial races, and Reuters reported that the 2025 Wisconsin Supreme Court race became the most expensive judicial election in U.S. history, with more than 90, that's 90 million spent on that wowzer.
That's a stunning figure. But what that means is that a judge in those systems may face something alien to the ideal of neutral adjudication. He may face the need to survive a campaign environment.
And campaign environments run on incentives. A judge may never get a phone call that says, "Rule for our side." No, but they can still hear the message loud and clear. Donors are watching. Party activists are watching. Interest groups are watching. Cable news is watching. Social media is watching. And one controversial criminal ruling can be turned into an attack ad.
That is why Brennan's work matters. Their review of social science research found that the pressures of reelection campaigns can make judges more likely to impose longer sentences, affirm death sentences, and even override life sentences to impose death.
And that is a profound institutional warning. If a judge thinks even for a minute, how will this ruling look in my next election campaign? Then law is no longer alone on the bench.
And the threat environment has become more explicit too. Reuters reported that this month, Marshals Service recorded 564 threats to 396 judges in fiscal year 2025, and that the number is still high in 2026. Wow. Reuters has also reported on judges and their families being targeted with harassment after politically charged rulings.
Yeah, breaking that down just a little bit here, Chandler. You said that the U.S. Marshals Service recorded 564 threats to 396 judges, and that judges are being targeted with harassment after politically charged rulings. Now, I must say that most of the politically charged rulings are ones that go contrary to conservative thought or the current administration's thought. Just wanted to add that in. So, in the US, pressure can come from elections, money, rhetoric, and fear. Not the same structure as China, but still, it's a very genuine threat to independence. So, Chandler, let me hand this off to you because this part gets less public attention than judges, and it should not. What am I talking about? I'm talking about prosecutors.
And this is really huge, Dr. Weaver. In the United States, most local prosecutors are elected, and a major national study from the University of North Carolina says 45 states elect prosecutors at the local level. That means that one of the most powerful actors in the criminal system often has to win office, keep office, and navigate public mood like a politician.
And prosecutors matter enormously because they decide what gets charged, how aggressively it gets charged, what plea bargains are offered, and how much punishment to seek. A judge is certainly very important, but the prosecutor often shapes the menu of outcomes before the judge ever sees the case.
Absolutely, Dr. Deneen. And research suggests that elections change that behavior. Chika Okafor's work found evidence that district attorneys in election years increased admissions in total months sentence per capita. With larger effects and contested elections, Republican counties and the South. Harvard summarized the finding this way: district attorneys push harder for convictions and sentences in election years.
Yep. And that's a striking result because it means punishment can intensify, not because crime suddenly changes, but because the political incentives around the prosecutor change.
And that is where so-called tough on crime policies become so dangerous. It creates a public stage on which caution looks weak, discretion looks suspicious, mercy looks irresponsible, and procedural fairness can be manipulatively recast as sympathy for criminals.
And because prosecutors are elected, they can be tempted to perform severity. They may feel pressure to bring the bigger charge, ask for the higher sentence, speak in the harshest register, or resist reform because any opponent can accuse them of endangering the public.
Ooh. You said that in such a scary way. Yes, but it's so right.
Well, it's a very scary thought, Dr. Weaver.
Yes, sir, it is. And then the public starts getting trained by the system too. People hear the message over and over. The safest prosecutor is the toughest prosecutor. The safest judge is the harshest judge, the hanging judge, so to speak. The safest system is the least restrained system.
And that's historically backwards, folks. The safest system in the long run is not the one with the loudest punishment culture. It is the one with the most trustworthy institutions.
Now, Dr. Deneen, if you don't mind, let me put the hardest U.S. question to you right out front.
Watch out, Dr. Dean. Here it comes.
How does tough on crime culture become a slide towards something worse?
Well, Chandler, it happens in stages. First, fear becomes politically useful. Then, public anger becomes a campaign resource. Then, caution begins to look like weakness. Then, judges and prosecutors start adapting to incentives. And worse, entire categories of people become morally flattened. Repeat offenders, gang members, extremists of all kinds, enemies, and threats. Then due process gets spoken of as if it were a loophole. Then the system gets praised for speed, certainty, and toughness rather than accuracy, restraint, and fairness.
And at that point, the culture has already shifted, even if the laws have not fully caught up.
So the danger is not that America literally copies another country's institution piece for piece. The danger is really that it develops the same habit of mind, the same appetite for visible harshness and invisible process.
Exactly. Different systems can arrive at similar moral mistakes for different purposes and by different roads.
And I want to add something here. The American version is often less centralized and less openly authoritarian, but that can make it easier to deny. We tell ourselves, no one ordered this, no one controls the whole thing. But if election pressure, donor pressure, media pressure, and threat pressure all push in the same direction, the result can still be systematic harshness. I also wanted to add something else. We are often told this story that the harsher punishments and that sort of thing cut down on crime. I think that number is anecdotal rather than factual and data driven. As a matter of fact, I think what happens is crime becomes, or it ramps up too.
And I agree with that, Dr. Weaver. I think that what you're saying is true. I think that sometimes, the story is that harsher punishments eliminate crime and reduce crime. I think in some ways the harsher punishments do quite the opposite. They bring more crime sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think so.
And the public can end up rewarding exactly the wrong qualities. Not courage, not fairness, not patience, not constitutional serious, but aggression, certainty, and just cruelty and evil dressed up as realism.
Which is why democratic decay often looks normal at first. It looks like another campaign, another ad, another speech accusing courts of weakness, another prosecutor promising no mercy, another judge deciding not to risk re-election. None of these moments looks like an execution van, but they can help build a mentality in which the extreme later becomes imaginable.
Okie doke. Let's bring the two halves of this episode together now. What does the execution van reveal about the system that created it?
It reveals a state comfortable enough with death to optimize it, a state secure enough in its power to hide the numbers, defend the method, and frame efficiency as civilization. And because the surrounding system is secretive, the van also becomes a symbol of all the things in non democratic government the public cannot fully inspect.
And when you layer onto it the history of organs from executed prisoners, the later reform claim, the continuing allegations involving minorities and prisoners of conscience, and the difficulty of independent verification, then you get a system that invites the worst possible questions.
Yes, Even uncertainty becomes morally significant here. If the state had true transparency, many of those questions could at least be tested. But opacity and irreversible punishment are a toxic combination.
They certainly are. And the religious point belongs here too, folks. When a government treats religious or ethno-religious minorities as automatically politically suspect, and when it uses broad categories like extremism or separatism to justify all types of coercion, the line between punishing conduct and punishing identity becomes frighteningly unstable.
Yes, it does, Dr. Deneen, and this means that the people most at risk may not simply be the worst criminals. They may also be the politically inconvenient. They may also be the culturally different, the ideologically non compliant, and the groups that the state has taught the public to fear.
Yeah, we could go on, but let's try and close this carefully. Um, Dr. Deneen, can you kind of give me the first piece and then hand it off to Chandler for the second piece?
Certainly. First, it's a fact the execution vans were real. They were part of a documented Chinese effort, particularly in the western provinces, to make execution more mobile and more efficient. China remains the world's leading executioner by available estimates, but the true figures are hidden as state secrets, and Chinese law formally requires Supreme People's Court approval for all death sentences.
And second, China historically used organs from executed prisoners. Mm. And said it ended that systematic practice in 2015, but UN experts later said they received credible allegations of organ harvesting involving detainees from ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities. So the issue is not fantasy. It is a documented history plus unresolved, very serious allegations in a rather opaque system.
Third, on the religious question, the careful statement is not that China openly posts executed for religion on a charge sheet. No, it is that religious and ethno-religious minorities have been severely repressed. The state categories like terrorism, separatism, extremism, and cult activity, or rather broad terms, are often used in ways critics say criminalize identity and practice, and that in some cases those systems overlap with extreme punishment like death.
Fourth, the broader warning is universal. When judges and prosecutors are pressured by politics, whether through direct party control, fear, election pressures, donor influence, public intimidation, bribes, or threats, justice becomes less independent and punishment becomes easier to weaponize.
And fifth, in the United States, that danger often moves through elected judges, elected prosecutors, attack ads, campaign money, tough on crime rhetoric, and a public culture that can confuse harshness with strength. Very big difference in the two, I might add. Very big difference. Like, some of the things that ICE are doing now. Just because they're hard, that doesn't mean they're strong. Yeah, there's a different structure, but the same temptation.
And maybe the simplest closing line is this: the scariest thing about an execution van is not the van, it's the system confident or blind enough or secret enough to build it, and the earlier political habits that made building it seem pretty normal.
Dr. Weaver, that's very well said.
Yeah, I have to agree.
And look, That's about all for today's episode of Things You Don't Know. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with someone who cares about law, human rights, and what happens when institutions stop resisting power. I want to thank you all for listening, and for Dr. Deneen and Chandler, I say goodbye for now.